trying to... Here it is. This piece from Al Jazeera that came out recently, Failing Gaza Behind the Lens of Western Media.
Another month goes by. Happy to be here. Hope your day is good.
Accent,
this is a moment in history that we don't often see, where we actually see genocide being perpetrated as it's happening. And in a situation where Western governments like the United States,
so I can get
UK,
subtitles,
and others have been complicit. You've got Western media that have actually become a part of the mechanism of genocide. That's what's different. That's what's frightening.
When political leaders speak of genocide, they repeat a time-worn mantra: never again. Over the past year, for the Palestinians of Gaza, again has become reality. A genocide broadcast almost in real time by its victims.
One sec. There is, in fact, a YouTube video version. So I can put up some subtitles.
About an alternative version of that reality, one told by major Western news organizations, how they have provided cover for an historic crime and have seen their inner workings exposed like never before. We have spoken with more than a dozen journalists who have been covering the Gaza genocide for the Western world's leading agenda-setting outlets, including the BBC in the UK and CNN in the US. Both describe a repeated failure to report the truth on this story.
Prior to October 7th, I, hand on heart, believed that CNN went to great lengths to report the truth, and exclusively the truth. But after October 7th, the ease with which I saw news lines that supported the Israeli narrative come out really shook me. There were times where CNN was happy to push hard, but on balance, it's very clear where we lie, regrettably, and it's not entirely with the truth.
Gaza has massively exposed the hypocrisies at the heart of the BBC. The fact that it very much does respond to influence, it very much can be swayed. It does follow the government line broadly on certain stories. The BBC is meant to be a public service. It's meant to be for the people. But at the end of the day, its purse strings are held by the government. And that you can see in the coverage.
The October 7th attack by Hamas, in which more than 1,100 Israelis were killed, almost 800 of them civilians, was the deadliest day in Israel's history. As they launched their retaliation, Israeli officials made clear this was not just a war on Hamas. Everyone in Gaza would be fair game.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור.
It's an entire nation out there that is responsible.
But, as with any genocide, the first step was to dehumanize the enemy.
Blood-thirsty terrorists who rape and burn people alive, and it's been reported on the BBC.
What happened on October 7th included acts that were bad enough in and of themselves. But if you want to create a context for dehumanization and genocide, you need to go further.
The Israeli Prime Minister's spokesman just confirmed babies and toddlers were found with their heads decapitated.
We saw false reports about beheaded babies, which never happened, about a systematic campaign of mass rape, which never happened, about babies being cut from the abdomen of their mothers, which never happened, and a whole series of other...
I mean, you have to remember, we even had fucking Biden on air saying that Hamas has gone in to the kibbutz and butchered and decapitated babies. And then later said something along the lines of, sorry, we don't have confirmation of that yet. After having just said that he had seen it.
Horrific atrocities. These were deliberately concocted official stories that were being provided in particular to a Western audience in order to create an atmosphere in which the crimes that were to follow would go on unchecked.
Shortly after October 7th, Israel sealed off Gaza's borders, including to foreign reporters. The Palestinian journalists left to tell the story would soon be killed at an unprecedented rate. Israeli forces quickly set their sights on Gaza's healthcare system. One by one, hospitals, swelling with patients and refugees, came under attack.
The difference between this genocide and the other wars that I had been in, the wars in Gaza, the 2021 war, the 2014 war, the 2012, 2009, and even the war in Yemen, the war in Syria, the comparison between them and a genocide is the comparison between a flood and a tsunami. In Gaza, 50% of the wounded
I'm just removing
were
some
children,
of the images.
and they remain so. The massacres never stop, the operating rooms never stop, and even when you're doing that, you then discover that you've only treated a small percentage of the wounded.
Israel wanted to begin a campaign to start taking out all of these medical facilities. In part, they were concerned that Hamas combatants were going to be treated in them, but also this was part of a war of annihilation to try to force the Palestinians in Gaza into a constant state of motion, moving from one place to another. Nowhere is safe for you, not even a hospital.
Here's the link to the video.
A home, a school, a hospital that hosts terrorists is not a home, is not a school, and is not a hospital. It's a terror base.
The Israelis were pumping the public with information that was meant to convince people that hospitals are not really hospitals.
Hamas was using the patients in that hospital as a human shield.
And this was a narrative that we saw unfolding almost from the beginning.
By November 10th, just over 1 month into Israel's assault, half of all hospitals in Gaza were out of service. One of them was the Rantisi Children's Hospital, which Israel bombed and then raided, after it claimed Hamas was using it to hide Israeli captives. Once inside, military spokesperson Daniel Hagari said Israeli forces had found proof and gave CNN special access.
Evidence, Hagari says, points towards Hamas and possible hostage presence below the hospital.
Hagari showed CNN's reporter, Nick Robertson, a document on the wall, which he claimed was a roster of Hamas members keeping guard over Israeli captives.
This is a guarding
The calendar. This is Hamas terrorist list. اثنين ثلاثة أربعة. Terrorist calendar. Sorry. Oh my God, it's terrorist known as Monday.
Every terrorist has his own shift.
This became quite an embarrassing moment for CNN because it wasn't a Hamas roster at all. It was a calendar, and written in Arabic was the days of the week. But the report that came out from Nick Robertson just swallowed up Israel's claim.
To make matters worse, the allegation that the calendar was
Murder Monday, Terror Tuesday, it's all here. Look, they even have Thursday for Hamas.
a Hamas roster had already been debunked on social media the day before the CNN broadcast. According to multiple CNN journalists and an internal WhatsApp log that we obtained, a Palestinian producer alerted her colleagues, including Robertson, but but was ignored. The report
Surely the journalist that brought this to CNN's attention and said, actually, that's not a terror list. That's actually just a calendar. That's actually just a calendar that says the days of the week and the dates, and it doesn't have any other information on it. Surely she wasn't ignored, right?
report went out, first on television, but there was still time to correct
they ignored her.
It before it went up online. Another producer tried to make that case.
Oh, surely they listened to the other producer that said, wait, okay, we know you aired it incorrectly on TV, but you guys can fix it now, right? Before it gets on the internet? We should correct it now and at least put out a statement saying we just found out that this is in fact a calendar, right?
Colleagues saw the report and flagged to Nick, hold on, people are saying that this is not accurate. And apparently Nick said, are you meaning to say that Hagari is lying to us? So there was a chance for this to get stopped, but Nick was adamant and it went out. He's a very experienced correspondent. If you are...
Surely it was just a mistake and not to further push Israeli propaganda, right? Right. They just made a mistake? They would never lie to spread the narrative that the terrorists need to be killed and Israel needs to defend itself, right?
Israeli government over your own colleagues, then you need to have your wrist slapped at the very least because your reporting has given cover to the Israeli operation.
No proof would ever emerge of captives held at the Rantisi hospital. Meanwhile, Israeli forces had turned their attention to the Shifa hospital, the largest in the Gaza Strip, responsible for 40% of its healthcare capacity. They began by releasing an animated video of a tunnel network beneath the hospital, which they described as Hamas's command and control center.
The White House and Pentagon today confirmed my reporting yesterday that the U.S. has intelligence suggesting Hamas is operating a command center under the Al-Shifa hospital.
As Israeli forces closed in on the hospital...
Jake Tapper? No. Jake Tapper is so good and based. Guys, Jake Tapper would never do anything like that.
Those claims were repeated, often with little to no pushback on Western news outlets.
And did the IDF show you anything that resembled an actual command and control center?
What we saw, Kana, was a pretty sophisticated-looking tunnel.
The New York Times and other news organizations began to then create their own renditions of what they, I guess, imagined Hamas had underneath Al-Shifa hospital, promoting the narrative that something very nefarious is.
And by the way, they've raised most of Gaza at this point, and we still haven't seen these terror tunnels. We still haven't seen these sophisticated terror tunnels, by the way, just so you guys are aware.
Taking place. That was the moment, and you can trace it, that the floodgates were opened for the Israelis, that they perceived that they now had a green light to wage war against Palestinian hospitals and medical facilities in Gaza.
Do you have what you need to treat people?
So we've run out of burns dressings, and there are over 100 patients with burns covering over 40% of their bodies.
One of probably the most distressing aspects about that period when I was working at Shifa Hospital is that we were getting hundreds and hundreds of wounded. The bombing around Shifa was continuous. And so you'd get phone calls, and all the Western journalists wanted to ask about was, when you walk around, do you see any tunnels?
Israel continues to maintain that beneath it in underground tunnels, Hamas has a command
It's Bootsy, thank you for the prime.
center. Is this something that you're aware of?
So, I mean, first of all...
And if you say that I've never seen any of the tunnels, then you are dismissed immediately.
It's hilarious that asking for journalistic integrity and asking for CNN or MSNBC or any of these programs to provide proof and evidence of this thing that lets them justify their bombing were terrorist sympathizers for saying, hey, could we just see the proof of this? Just a little bit of evidence so that we know what's happening, just so we can get a confirmation. That is terrorist sympathizing. You're not taking Israel at face value, the state that has lied hundreds of times. I bet you want Hamas to kill every single Jew. I bet that's what you want. You anti-Semitic piece of shit. It's like, what? What the fuck? What the fuck? It's Bootsy. Thank you for the Prime. Lex, thank you so much for the 13 months.
After 2 weeks of bombing the Shifa compound, Israeli forces stormed the hospital on November 15th.
The target of the war is to defeat Hamas.
Once again, Daniel Hagari was there to show the world some weapons he claimed belonged.
Do you remember when they said that the Hamas operatives were storing guns in the MRI machine?
To Hamas, alongside some tunnels, many of which were built by Israel in the 1980s. Nothing that remotely resembled a command center.
Fucking Hagari pointing at the air conditioner.
In the 1980s, nothing that remotely resembled a command center.
Like if you see here, this is Hamas air conditioner. Terror air conditioner.
Since the raids on Shifa and Rantisi, every hospital in Gaza has been attacked, put out of service, or demolished. Witnesses have described mass executions, including of patients and medical staff, testimonies that barely registered in the Western news cycle.
أصعب شيء والخوف اللي شفته لما كانوا يطخوا النزلان قدام عينينا وكانوا يفحروا الجوار ويحطوا 5 6 بقلب جورة ويدفنوه.
Oh, sorry, I should be reading this out loud.
اللي شفته لما كانوا.
She said the hardest and most terrifying thing I saw was when they were executing people right in front of us.
قدام عينينا.
They'd dig a hole, they would throw 5 or 6 people in it, and then they would bury them.
Mass graves were found, with hundreds of bodies.
Over 800 health workers, doctors, nurses, paramedics who've been killed. That kind of dismantlement of health was a critical component of the genocidal machine, because what that did is it ensured that anybody who's wounded die of their wounds, and that anyone with a chronic disease would eventually die of that disease. You add to the mix the famine, and so the wounded are now dying because they are malnourished.
This, they say, is a Hamas tunnel that...
Not only are you exacerbating issues that already exist, so people, I know that there have been multiple recorded instances of people who've talked about their asthma or their diabetes or whatever, them needing something specific to live. I guess you're not going to get that anymore, and I guess you have to die because of this conflict. But technically, Israel didn't airstrike you, so that doesn't count towards one of our deaths. We didn't actually kill you because we didn't airstrike you.
Connects to a tunnel network underneath the Al Shifa hospital.
The Western media was critical to the process of...
Like, look at this headline. Israel's hunt for Hamas puts Gaza's Al Shifa hospital under siege. Excellent, excellent headline.
Demonization of the Palestinian health system. And what is shocking is that when the Israelis went...
Israel publishes proof. Hamas is hiding terror tunnels under hospital. Dude, I think I'm getting word right now from Israel that Hamas is actually, they're hiding their terror tunnels underneath the telegraph. Yeah, Israel, you're good to airstrike them. No. You're good to, yeah. No. You're good to airstrike them. I'm telling you, there are terror tunnels under there. Looks like also CNN, MSNBC. Yeah, they're also there as well. Yeah. BBC as well. Wow. They're everywhere. Whoa. Israel, get on it.
Into Shifa, and there were no real evidence of these bunkers. These media outlets did not recant their original stories.
Jody Rudoran spent 2 decades as a reporter and an editor for the New York Times. She rejects the idea that these features of Western news coverage are the result of any inherent bias.
I begin from a premise that most journalists who are covering conflicts are doing so because they believe that bearing witness to what governments and terror groups do to each other is critically important to the functioning of democracy and of a civil society. These people are trying their very hardest to do the very best that they can. What I think is not true is that there is any kind of systemic bias, like in the structural editorial processes of these newsrooms. I think these newsrooms are trying to report a 360-degree view of an extremely complicated storyline that many of the actors in the storyline don't want to acknowledge the complexity of.
Western news outlets are not monoliths.
Israeli soldiers have been filmed standing over stripped and kneeling detainees in Gaza. But these are medical staff.
Arjumana Karachi and colleagues spent weeks documenting an attack in January that killed more than half of the members of one family.
Many mainstream journalists do try to speak truth to power, and their reporting has, at times, undercut Israel's claims.
And just to be clear, there's a distinction. What they're saying is there's a distinction between individual journalists and news organizations. That there are lots of journalists that try their best to push out articles against all the garbage that their own news network loves to push out. And then those reports get buried. Those reports get ignored. Individual journalist does not equal the news network itself.
Exposed its war crimes. Journalists at the time,
And yeah,
CNN,
some of them get fired for it, i.e. Mehdi Hassan. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. It's the difference between a journalist and fucking Jake Tapper. Yep.
and the BBC have told us it can be a struggle to get those stories past editors. Israel's denial of access into Gaza has made the job even more difficult. But it's the larger trends rather than individual examples that shape the effect that media coverage has on audiences. On the Gaza story, they have been quantifiable and point in one direction. A study by the news website The Intercept of post-October 7th coverage by the New York Times, the Washington
Cash Sky, thank you so much for the 2 months.
Post, and the LA Times found that Israeli deaths were covered on average 16 times more often than when the victims were Palestinian. Words like slaughter and massacre were used to describe attacks that killed Israelis at least 60 times more frequently than for mass killings of Palestinians.
I'm sure that was just like it was just a coincidence that they happened to use that word as many times as they did to describe Israelis. Right?
When those terms were almost never used.
The New York Times headlines are filled with volume after volume of story where Palestinians appear to have been killed in a mysterious attack waged by no one. You know, Palestinians are always referred to as dying in the passive tense. It's very clear that there is an agenda from the leadership of the New York Times, and that's been attested to by whistleblowers in the newsroom who said that it's very clear that they're steering coverage in particular direction and that Palestinians are subjected to a different set of standards than Israelis when talking about their deaths, their sufferings, or their perspectives.
There was a massacre on October 7th. There were atrocities committed. It was barbaric. I think those were appropriate words to use, and the response was intense. It involved a lot of death, destruction, and displacement. But I'm not sure that massacre, barbaric, and atrocity are appropriate terms, certainly not for the full scale of the war. There are individual attacks within the war that may where some of those words may be appropriate. So it's just you're talking about two very different things.
just a little war crime as a treat. Just as a weird tweet.
And they deserve different adjectives.
For Sarah at the BBC, double standards could also be seen in the selection of interviewees and how they were treated. In the days after October 7th, the BBC set up an internal group chat in which producers could vet potential interviewees based on their online footprint. We have obtained messages from that chat, which Sarah says was used disproportionately against defenders of Palestinian rights.
It was overwhelmingly guests on the Palestinian side of things who were being looked into. Palestinians being flagged up for using the
video called. I linked it earlier, but unfortunately there's a cat on me, so I can't link it again. But it's from Al Jazeera. It's called "Inside Western Media's Report on Gaza: The Listening Post."
Word Zionist, which isn't something to flag necessarily.
Exclamation point watching.
Even the occasional NGO was thrown in. For example, Human Rights Watch. These are organizations that we've really relied on in terms of covering Ukraine and various other conflicts. And now and again, they would check an Israeli guest. But there was no balance in what was going on. Israeli spokespeople who we did have on were given a lot of free rein to say whatever they wanted with very little pushback.
Babies were set on fire. Babies were shot in the head.
Whereas any Palestinian guest was asked to condemn Hamas.
But I want to ask you specifically about Hamas's actions today. Do you support them?
Almost as though condemning Hamas was the sort of price to pay before they could be humanized in our coverage. Many of our own presenters, when faced with an interviewee who was Palestinian or who had lost family in Gaza, there was just such a lack of compassion.
I'm sorry for your own personal loss. I mean, can I just be clear, though? You cannot condone the killing of civilians in Israel, can you?
As a result, a number of producers were really reticent about putting a vulnerable Palestinian guest in front of a BBC presenter.
We watched one particular interview. I don't remember the name of the person that was on. And he owned the fuck out of this lady. She hit him with the "Can you condemn Hamas?" And he literally was talking about, do you hear yourself? Do you condemn the IDF for killing 10,000 innocent Palestinians? Do you condemn? Well, it's not the same. Well, it's not the, well.
The mounting double standards have provoked a backlash in the newsrooms of many Western outlets. Journalists at the New York Times and the BBC have resigned publicly, citing their consciences.
Fucking base, dude. Fucking. One second, be right back. Just grabbing something to drink. I'm really thirsty.
Others have tried to change things from the inside. BBC staff have repeatedly complained to the network's Director General. One email we obtained, signed in February by more than 20 journalists, warned the corporation's coverage risked aiding and abetting genocide. Staff at the Times leaked details of an internal rebellion over a now notorious report that claimed Hamas weaponized sexual violence on October 7th, an allegation that was exposed as baseless. 70 journalism professors have demanded the Times do an investigation into that report. The Times did conduct an investigation, not into its story, but to find the source of the leak. Numerous journalists we have spoken to describe variations of the same theme. Interference from executives and editors, the kind they have never faced on any other story.
There's a divide between the many good journalists within CNN who jump through so many hoops to tell the true story and push back from high-level management demanding that you tone down criticisms of Israel. There was a period of time when we couldn't call airstrikes in Gaza airstrikes unless we had confirmation from the Israelis.
A massive explosion at the largest refugee camp in Gaza. Joining us now is Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hecht.
It's really depressing because we would not be doing this in any other place. We would not tolerate the need to ask, say, the Russians whether they bombed a hospital in Kiev. So the double standards are really shocking. You try and change managers' minds, you feel like you're making progress, and then something happens, and you feel like you're back at square one. For example, more recently, on the day that 40,000 Palestinian deaths were announced, Mike McCarthy, who's number 3 in the organization, said in the morning editorial call that we need to contextualize and hold Hamas accountable. And that was reflected in the framing from the shows.
The Gaza Health Ministry says more than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed since the October 7th Hamas massacre in Israel that triggered the war.
Multiple journalists, in emails, in meetings, have raised concerns about a lot of the things I've said in this interview. The disparity in the language used, the inconsistency in approach compared to other story areas like Russia and Ukraine, the lack of humanization when it comes to Palestinians, the lack of context about this conflict before the 7th of October. And it hasn't really made a difference because there's just a sort of unwillingness among the executive to accept evidence. For me personally, it meant I could no longer see my future at the BBC.
The lessons learned in 1945, if mankind would remember them, could make the world a better place for all men.
In the wake of the World War II Holocaust, Western governments built a new international legal order, a central pillar of which was the prevention of any future genocide. Since the early stages of Israel's onslaught in Gaza, experts on genocide have been sounding the alarm. In January, the International Court of Justice described a case accusing Israel of genocide as plausible. 2 months later, a report by the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories found that the threshold for genocide had been met.
We cannot avert our eyes. We must confront genocide. We must prevent it, and we must punish it.
The decision by the United States and its allies to continue supporting Israel diplomatically and militarily makes them complicit.
And may God bless the great alliance between Israel and America forever.
And that has put those news outlets and their journalism to the test, caught between the positions of their own governments and the realities of international law.
This mantra that Israel has a right to defend itself, which has been repeated over and over and over again in Western media.
Israel has a right to defend itself?
Israel has an absolute right to defend itself.
Israel has a right not only to defend itself, but to seek the military destruction of Hamas.
Yes, Israel had a right on October 7th to repel attacks on its territory, but it has no right under international law to make war on the Gaza Strip, a territory that, according to the law, it has occupied for 57 years. So that little rhetorical device of claiming that Israel has a right to defend itself has been used and abused in Western media to provide justifications for wholly unlawful acts.
Israel has a right to defend itself. That was the editorial line that was drilled into us, into all of our coverage. It was really an integral part of the editorial stance. To a guest talking about, Israeli airstrikes killing Palestinians in Gaza, that would be the response from our presenters.
Denying access to food is collective punishment, and that we should all be clear in saying that.
Israel will argue, obviously, that it has a right to defend itself.
People were terrified of using the word genocide in coverage. They still are. You will very rarely see it in any BBC coverage. And if an interviewee says the word genocide,
this is a genocide happening in front of our eyes.
That word is, as you know, incredibly emotive, and the Israelis, as you know, will be saying that they are targeting Hamas only.
The presenter will almost always panic.
The Labour Party, of all political parties, which has always had a strong peace contingent within it, is now actually supporting genocide.
Okay, if we can maybe just avoid that language, if that's okay.
Having destroyed Gaza's healthcare system, Israel has laid waste to virtually every town and city there. It has slain more journalists in 1 year than were killed in all of World War II. They are among at least 41,000 Palestinians killed. And experts say the real death toll could be several times higher, in excess of 150,000. The response from Israel's primary Western allies has been one of denial. about the depths of the horror and their own complicity. As for the Western world's most influential news outlets, they have suppressed the story, amplified the Israeli propaganda that has accompanied it, and downplayed the telltale signs of genocide.
Western mainstream media have invested a lot in trying to draw a curtain across this genocide and disseminating an alternative narrative that makes the crimes happening in Gaza somehow justifiable. And the reason this is so dangerous is because it creates room for Western countries to create a cloak of impunity, and it creates a sense that some countries are above the law, that might makes right, that all of the efforts to build an international order since the Second World War governed by the rule of law may begin to crumble.
It is impossible to overstate the role that the incendiary media coverage played in the events that would unfold after Hamas and its allies broke down the fence that surrounds Gaza.
You're not Hamas. Israel is a democracy and as a Jewish state supports and believes in every life mattering.
Israel was able to perform and
I like how October 7th turned mainstream media into like the cop state where you were trying to be a good journalist. That meant you had to leave. Yeah. Varric Dog, thank you. That's really nice of you. Manufacturer, thank you for the prime. Thank you, guys. Dana Fascist. Yeah. I made myself real food, guys, yesterday. It's real chicken.
in front of the world a master class in manipulation of the media. And so you had a narrative set that Netanyahu and Biden on their own would not have had the power to drill into the minds of the public, but for the existence of major Western news organizations promoting it for free.
In the future, when we have a museum for this genocide, we will have a special place where we put the pictures of the journalists who allowed it to happen. There will be a wing for the CNN and the BBC and the Times journalists who were the enablers of the genocide. The Palestinian people will remember them.
On the screen it says, we asked CNN, BBC, and the New York Times for their response to the issues raised in this film. CNN denies that senior management demanded that journalists tone down criticisms of Israel. A CNN spokesperson said this is an immensely complex and emotive story to cover, but we have been and remain completely committed to telling it accurately. We fundamentally reject the notion of any notion of bias in our coverage. The thing is, there's going to be bias in any type of media coverage. I mean, there's bias in my coverage. There's bias in Hassan's coverage. There's bias in all types of coverage. 1,100,000%. There's going to be bias everywhere. There's going to be propaganda everywhere. But there is a very big difference between there being bias in reporting and a major news network ignoring the fact that the story that they're reporting on is inaccurate. Those are so... It is such a leap to go from bias and propaganda to, yeah, well, we don't really care that this isn't what's actually happening. We don't actually care that the babies aren't getting beheaded. The thing is, we were told to manufacture consent, so that's what we're doing. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't notice that there was more text. Our morning editorial calls are a place for discussion and debate as we frame the stories. Sorry, excuse me. As we frame the stories of the day, it is completely reasonable that of the roles of both Hamas and the Israeli military be discussed and contextualized in any discussion about the war. End quote. Quote, the BBC holds itself to high standards of impartial reporting and rejects any suggestion that our reporting is not independent. We report without fear or favor. Dude, suck my dick. We reject the suggestion that we treat guests differently, looking across the breadth of interviews across all BBC networks and news platforms and programs. We do not think there's a difference in how we interview people. We investigated ourselves and found we did nothing wrong. Our coverage of the Israel-Hamas war has unrelentingly displayed fearless impartiality through thoughtful nuance and rigorous devotion to the facts, taking care to ensure our language choices are sensitive yet objective and clear to our readers. Ah, okay. New York Times continues by saying this is one of the most culturally and politically divisive global events in recent history, and we, like other independent news organizations, are facing near daily attempts from partisan voices and advocacy groups seeking to discredit or influence our coverage, hoping that we might adjust our reporting to buttress their perspectives. We remain open to good faith disagreement and will not be swayed from independent journalism. Tuh. Yeah. Yeah. Quick question before you in the stream. Are you going to put up a Christmas tree in time or in January? Stop. I will put it up when it is time. When it is right to put it up. All right. No sooner, no later. I definitely do think that there were a lot of these news networks that got better about their reporting over time. But let's see. Let's see if they prove me right or wrong right now. Like the BBC. Just recently, this came out a few hours ago, talking about the airstrikes in Beirut. Large explosions in Beirut after Israeli strikes. More than 30 airstrikes have taken place in the southern suburbs of Beirut, where Hezbollah has a strong presence. Let's see.
You're watching BBC News. You join us here in southern Israel, in the kibbutz of Nir Oz, in front of the one in many homes in this community, which used to be home to some 400 Israelis. Now only 2 people live here. The entire family, which once lived in this home and others, were killed in Hamas's murderous rampage across kibbutz and towns of southern Israel on October the 7th, from the 82-year-old grandmother to the 2-year-old child. In a moment, we'll be speaking to one of the family members who survived. But now let's look at the latest news this hour, beginning in Lebanon, where Israeli bombardment continued overnight. Some 30 strikes were reported on the Lebanese capital, Beirut. We can see a picture of the Beirut skyline here when the attacks were taking place. Lebanese media described, as you can see, the attacks as very violent. You can see the plumes of smoke rising. There were more than 30 attacks in southern suburbs of Beirut. Hezbollah has a strong presence there, but it's a densely populated residential area too. Residents were filmed fleeing in panic as people tried to find safety. Meanwhile, the southern border remains tense. Hezbollah fired some 30 rockets into northern Israel last night. The air raid sirens sounded. Most people have been evacuated from this area over the past year, but some are reaching beyond the areas declared military zones by Israel. Let's get a look at all the latest developments. We have this report from our correspondent, Will Vernon.
The bombing in Beirut goes on. Giant flames leapt in.
Someone already mentioned it, but they're still using passive language right now. Crazy how a large explosion just happens. Crazy that they are still using so much passive language. This headline less so, but
into the night sky over the city's southern suburbs. Several secondary explosions appear to have been caused by the initial strikes. Shortly before the blasts, the Israeli military sent out an urgent warning to the area's residents that they should evacuate immediately. As the explosions continued, planes were still seen landing at Beirut airport. Today, another evacuation flight for British nationals is due to leave. The UK government says no more are planned. Just across the border, northern Israel also came under attack from Lebanon. The country's Iron Dome air defences were activated. And after this huge ballistic missile attack last week, the Israeli Prime Minister vowed revenge on Iran.
No country in the world would accept such an attack on its cities and citizens, and nor will Israel. Israel has the duty and the right to defend itself and respond to these attacks, and it will do so.
In Lebanon, urgently needed assistance is being rushed into the country. Aid agencies say the humanitarian situation is rapidly getting worse. This escalating conflict has now forced more than 1 million people from their homes. And with tensions rising across this region, it's ordinary civilians that are feeling the pain. Will Vernon, BBC News.
Well, let's get the latest now from Beirut this morning. We can join our correspondent there, Lina Sinjab. Lina, it's being described as the most violent night yet in Beirut after what have been many days of...
They started the report by talking about settler colonists getting killed. I think referring to last year as a sympathetic thing, yeah.
Bombardments. Just tell us what it was like last night.
It was really apocalyptic, Lise. People felt that they are watching hell on earth. You know, the fire, the constant attacks, the fear, you know, whether people who are in Dahya or surrounding Dahya, or even a little bit far from Dahya, the sound, the scene of it and the feel of these bombardments were terrible. Of course, this is not the first night that Lebanese that are living these kind of horror moments. There have been nights and nights of sleepless hours for the Lebanese.
Yeah, Lebanon is a country of 5 million people. 1 million people getting displaced is 20% of the population being displaced. Yeah. And that's not even talking about the fact that Iran, separate from Lebanon, Iran recently has shut down airports because they have seemingly intel that Israel will be striking soon. This is from 2 hours ago. Flights from Iran's airports canceled due to operational restrictions. Iran's aviation body has announced the cancellation of flights at the country's airports, citing, quote, operational restrictions, according to the state's media. Iran's civil organization said that the flights at some of the airports of the country will be canceled from 21 o'clock. Is that, 9. Sorry, I hate military time. 9 p.m. tonight, PST. Or, sorry, not PST, GMT. No. EST. Sunday, the 6th of October until 6 a.m. tomorrow. On the 7th of October. Iran implemented flight restrictions on Tuesday when it launched ballistic missiles at Israel earlier this week, an attack that Israel has vowed to retaliate. Yeah. So, yay, even more people can't leave the country. Oh boy.
Airstrikes overnight and, destruction during the day that they look after. They see, people fleeing. There are dead people. It's just an attack after the other. And for the Lebanese, really, it's obvious for them. It's not only an attack on Hezbollah or a defense of the southern
Joey, thank you so much for the 5 gift subs. Thank you.
Border for the Israelis, but an expanded attack. This is how the Lebanese see it, to cripple Hezbollah and to stop any kind of resistance against Israel. And that could be a target anywhere, anytime, even in civilian areas.
Sorry, I think I said Joey. I meant Joel. Sorry about that. Thank you for the 5 gift subs.
And what are the reports from those areas this morning? Are emergency crews able to access the area to try to rescue the injured and take away any bodies if there have been people killed?
So far, there hasn't been reports of, emergency teams arriving on site, but we've seen in several, attacks, some of the sites, emergency teams haven't been able to reach because it's consecutive attacks after the other. Of course, residents in the area have been warned by the Israel Defense Forces. There were 3 warnings for evacuation of 8 neighborhoods, but the effect of these strikes is going beyond the neighborhoods or where the precise attacks are taking place. We've seen even outside Dahye, people are fleeing on foot, seeking, help and finding safety areas. So these are stories that are happening on a daily basis of running away for safety and daily efforts for rescue operation, for finding shelters and for treating the wounded or retrieving bodies.
Lina Sinjab, thank you very much for joining us with the latest from the capital, Beirut. Well, 1 year on, despite the growing calls for a ceasefire, most of all for Israelis to bring the hostages home, the situation continues to be one of escalation and mounting tension, not just here in Israel, but across the region, with Israel widely expected to retaliate for Iran's barrage of nearly 200 ballistic missiles, which was in itself a retaliatory strike. My colleague Laura Koonsberg has been speaking to Israel's ambassador to the UK this morning, Sipi Hotavelli, who outlined Israel's perspective right now.
So we're not interested to be under a missile threat from Iran. We're not interested to be under this ring of fire from the proxies. This is why we will dismantle the threat. This is for the cabinet to decide how. But we will dismantle the threat because no country will tolerate that.
But could that include a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities? Because that would, perhaps you would acknowledge this, many Western leaders think that would move the whole world into a new phase of danger. President Biden has asked Israel to rule out attacking Iran's nuclear sites. Will you?
We will do everything that will remove a threat first. Second,
fuck you.
And if the world wants to prevent something like that, first of all, we need to prevent from Iran nuclear abilities, because if this is what Iran is doing without nuclear abilities, can you imagine what this...
Don't worry, guys. They're going to have nuclear weapons tomorrow. They actually just made the nuclear weapons 5 seconds ago. And who has the fucking... Not actually, but who's got the epic rap battles? I am Adolf Hitler.
Regime of terror, this regime that killed and executed Masa Amini, that doesn't care about our values, that is against any Western and liberal values. Can you imagine what this regime can do?
Israel's ambassador to Britain outlining Israel's war aims.
Fuck you, dude. Hey, are you going to... Are you guys going to hit the nuclear power plants? Biden explicitly said you shouldn't do that because that would be really bad. We will do whatever we need to do. Okay. Nice.
Now, but even as the war intensifies across the border in Lebanon and also tensions escalate with Iran, the war in Gaza goes on. These are the latest developments. Now, we can take a look at the map of that area where Israeli forces, they say they've encircled Jabalia in northern Gaza again, saying that Hamas is trying to rebuild its capabilities in the north. Israel says it struck dozens of targets before troops moved in, including weapons storage sites and underground infrastructure. And in central Gaza, at least 24 people were killed and dozens wounded after Israeli warplanes struck a mosque in Deir al-Balah. That's according to Palestinian media. Israel says Hamas had been using the compound as a command center, but eyewitnesses in the area said it was housing displaced people. The mosque was being used as a shelter. And beyond this region and around the world, pro-Palestinian marches are being held this weekend. This is the latest image from a march held in Sydney, Australia. All of them come, of course, just as this terrible anniversary, the 1 year on since the attacks of October 7th in southern Israel, in kibbutzes and in towns across this area, and triggered this current conflict that we are reporting on today. In a moment, we're going to speak to a resident of this community, this kibbutz of Nir Oz, but let's get the latest from our correspondent in Jerusalem, John Donnison.
People in Beirut saying that it was the worst night of this conflict so far. You had those massive explosions quite close to the airport, a huge fireball going up into the sky, some speculation that some sort of fuel depot, even a petrol station might have been hit, but it looked pretty scary, and those strikes have been going on into this morning. So Israel absolutely not letting up, and at the same time, as you said in your introduction, Hezbollah continuing to fire back.
And have Israel given any indication of what plans they have in their response that we're all expecting to the Iranian missile attack?
No, they haven't, but it's going to come. You know, it was a Jewish holiday in Israel for the Jewish New Year at the end of last week. That has now finished, and it's not a question of if, but when. So Israel has a range of targets it could go for. It could go for economic targets, so that could be oil refineries, power stations, that sort of thing, to try and hit Iran's economy. That would be at the low end of the scale. It could then obviously target Iran's nuclear facilities, something that the United States is very much urging caution on. And then at the top end, I guess, I spoke to a very senior former Israeli army general last week who said he didn't rule out possibly an assassination attempt on Iran's supreme leader. So that would obviously be a huge escalation. We don't know when it's going to happen. Prime Minister Netanyahu gave an address last night, and he said that the region was facing the forces of barbarism led by Iran. So that strike is going to come. We just don't know when.
You know what I'm thinking, guys? Another 10 trillion to Israel. In fact, I'm going to bring my best homie on stream that agrees with me. Good old Fetterman. Fetterman lauds Israel for leaving Iran exposed and humiliated after strikes on Hamas and Hezbollah. On Fox News? This must be a mistake. Fetterman on Fox News, this must be a mistake.
Now the U.S. is stepping up